Hello, everybody. It's Saturday, September the 13th, 2025. I think this will run tomorrow on Sunday, the 14th. One of the things that's always intrigued me about America, it's one of the central paradoxes, I guess, of the American Republic, is on the one hand, in cultural and political terms, it's always idealized itself as a place of second chances, a place of reinvention, a place, in some ways, I guess, of forgiveness. On the other hand, of course, it has, depending how you measure it, the most extensive criminal system in the world in terms of prisons and punishment. And I wonder how these two things go together. It's one of the key paradoxes of the Republic. My guest today is a very distinguished professor of law. She's the Arthur Lyman Professor of Law at Yale Law School, America's leading law school. And she has a new book out on punishment. It's called Impermissible Punishments: How Prison Became a Problem for Democracy. As I said, Judith Resnik teaches at Yale, and she's joining us from New Haven in Connecticut. Judith, before we get to the book, is that a fair paradox? Is that a fair way of framing it? On the one hand, America is supposedly, or thinks of itself as, a place of second chances, of reinvention. And yet, on the other hand, it has this incredibly unforgiving criminal justice system.
I want to separate out. So first of all, yes, at the moment we have a very unforgiving, but actually saying we is a little bit of an overstatement because, as you know, each state runs its own system, plus there's a layer of the federal system. So that means that there are a variety of different systems, and some are more or less, if you want to say, forgiving or less punitive than not. Many are radically way over punitive. But the intervention of this book is to tell the story as if America grew its own system out of its own ideas, is to miss that the development of punishment ideas, norms, purposes, practices, modes is a transatlantic development starting in England and Europe in terms of the US story in the 1700s and moving forward. And one of the elements that have been missing in discussing the United States is the seeing clearly that the amount of thought and energy that went into thinking about what you can do to people who are in detention has been a transatlantic project. De Tocqueville, who wrote, as you know, because I've heard you speak about him, on democracy, and came and visited prisons in the 1830s, he and another young minor aristocrat named Gustave Beaumont.
Yeah, and of course, that's why they came. They didn't come to study democracy. They came to study prisons.
Well, they came to study prisons. Their journals actually are full of things not related to prisons, because they were also coming to have a graceful exit for a little bit from France with its tumult that they were in complicated relationship with. And when they visited prisons, they were astute in a host of ways. But Tocqueville described them accurately as despotic. And his translator, a German man who became very famous named Lieber, criticized them for how could you, kind of in the timbre you were describing about America, in this great country, describe it as despotic. And de Tocqueville and de Beaumont weren't saying it negatively. They, like Lieber and most of their era, took it to be appropriate to exercise authoritarian despotic control over people who were in detention. How you did it, whether it was chaotic, crowded, single cell, however you did it, you could debate. But the accepted idea was that it was permissible to radically intrude on human autonomy for the people who were detained after conviction. And that idea isn't born in the United States. It's shared by a whole bunch of people. The United States has unfortunately continued beyond, but not always. So one of my hopes is that people realize how hard the question is of how you punish people in our current democratic orders, because the book is Impermissible Punishments, How Prison Became a Problem for Democracy, and back to de Tocqueville and despotism. If you don't think people are equal people once they're convicted, or for race, religion, ethnicity, gender, pick your category, then you don't have as much of a problem about how you punish them. You might want to be humane or not. You might want to be careful or not. You might want to be useful as a utilitarian, see Jeremy Bentham. And Jeremy Bentham was actually concerned about the well-being of all the people who were in detention for utilitarian, and he didn't want to talk much in a moral timber, but he's a very interesting.
But let's get to Bentham, because Bentham, of course, was also the architect of the famous Panopticon,
yes,
which he tried to sell to the enlightened despot at the time, or his brother tried to sell to the enlightened despot of the time in Russia. The idea of prison and surveillance, of course, very much developed by Michel Foucault, the French historian, in his famous work, Discipline and Punishment. It was Discipline and Punish, I guess, in the French translation. When it comes to punishment, Judith, and de Tocqueville and Bentham, was prison imagined as a place of reform or of punishment, or do those two things go together? Because it comes back to my initial question about second chances. I understand that if you go to jail, you get punished, but was the thinking of prison reformers from Bentham to Tocqueville was that if you punish people appropriately, you will also reform them? Or was prison seen purely as a form of punishment?
I'm going to slow down and disaggregate for a minute and come back to Foucault, who got, in some respects, Bentham wrong and in other ways right. So if I slow down for a minute, there are about a half a dozen major Enlightenment figures who start thinking about punishment. And if we back up, because you mentioned the monarch of the time, the people who ran, monarchs, gods, who ran countries could punish willy-nilly any way they wanted. The intervention, first in Italy by Beccaria, Cesare Beccaria, then Bentham, Tocqueville, a whole bunch of people, John Howard, Lucas, we can go on, was, excuse me, you have to reason and have good reasons to punish, which is a way to answer your question. Because the reasons they proffered weren't all the same. Some were retributivist punishment, wanting to just be angry. Some were looking
an eye for an eye, essentially, right? Good old biblical punishment.
Some were reformers, and John Howard believed that through redemptive suffering would get reformation. We call it rehabilitation more now. Some, Jeremy Bentham, were utilitarian who said, what I really want to do is deter future crime and scare the wits out of you to not commit crimes. And one of the ways to do that, which is why Foucault was wrong, is in the Panopticon prison that Bentham envisioned and wrote a whole bunch of descriptions about. You were supposed to have a big observatory tower. People were supposed to come in because Bentham wanted to show people that it was bad to be there, so that your rational acting calculus would be that you would not commit crimes. And moving further into the Bentham story, Bentham, his first of all, the workhouse Russia was one form. There's more than one kind of panopticon. Second, the Panopticon prison, he had a contract, if you read the details, healthcare, adequate food.
Yeah, hospitals, education. It was all the Panopticon model.
And yes, but Bentham wanted to be the governor. He didn't get England to sign the contract that was proffered. And there's a new book coming out from the Bentham project at University College London, UCL, and it is his despair at not getting the Panopticon built.
And just to interrupt, Judith, just to remind everyone that Bentham, of course, if you want to go and see the old man, you can still see him in the foyer at UCL, University College London, where I know you're a fellow. He's still there. He's stuffed. He's not alive, although you get a pretty good idea of what he was like.
If we follow that thread for one moment, as an auto icon, he was a remarkable visionary on public relations, because you can't visit a lot of other famous philosophers, so he has a certain visibility.
He's still watching over us. He's still surveying us.
Well, one version is that he was we know that he was anti-religion, and it's a spoof on religion. We know he was anti-aristocracy, and he said anybody could be their own statue. And we also know that he really wanted to convince people of what he thought was right. So he's got a lot of reasons to try to be stuffed and seen. And for anybody who was at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, you could have seen him because he crossed the ocean and came to an exhibit called Lifelike that they had at the Art Museum. Coming back to what it was he envisioned, he also wanted the governor of the prison to have to pay money, lose money for his salary if anybody died, because he was trying to align the incentives. Coming back to your question about second chances, he wanted people to learn to work, to get money when they left and be able to function. And he wrote about not wanting to mark the offender, but mark the offense, because he was trying to stop offenses. And coming back to his Italian decade earlier predecessor, Beccaria, proportionality, utility. And if those of you who think about wanting to think about what people who founded the United States meant about punishment, these great punishment theorists, with their limits that I'll get to in a minute, these great punishment theorists were also clear that punishment might change over time. Beccaria said, as we get to be less punitive, the barbary will be reduced. And he's famous for wanting to end capital punishment. So, and there's a great frontispiece where he has a justice image looking away from 3 severed heads that are being proffered to her by an executioner. So Beccaria was an abolitionist on capital punishment and wanted to reform punishment. Bentham was an abolitionist on transportation to the colonies. And one of the reasons was he thought it was useless, because if you stuck people out in first the United States and then in Australia, in New South Wales, you couldn't see them. And the whole point was to deter.
Well, no, I just actually came back from Australia, of course, was founded as a punitive state. So let's, there's so much to talk about here, Judith, and I keep on interrupting, so please forgive me. But you said earlier that you felt that the American criminal justice system was imported from Europe. It was a European project, maybe an Anglo-French one. But you also said that you thought that Foucault got it wrong in his discipline and punishment. What did he get wrong?
Okay, I'm going to, the punishment project, we got to get Italy, Europe, the United States as joint ventures in the 17 and 1800s developed these norms for detention and punishment. And they proffered incarceration as an alternative punishment, and they succeeded. Very few places transport people. We have a scary issue in the United States about this effort to send people away to unsafe places. But transportation, we hope, is dead. And United States, outlier, as you pointed out, still has capital punishment when most other places don't. And when you say impermissible punishments, just spoke to an Italian yesterday who said, my first association is no capital punishment. Stop there. The next part, in terms of what got wrong, is that Foucault talks as if Bentham were a radical privatizer of punishment to make it secret. And what I was pointing out is that punishment was supposed to be walk into my prison, here's the platform, go to the observation tower, and look at how awful it is to be here, so you will not commit an offense.
Yeah, throwing in another famous English philosopher, Hobbes. Of course, Hobbes believed we were always driven by fear. I guess there's a Hobbesian quality to Bentham's thinking, that people could be reformed, or at least they could be forced to behave themselves if they were fearful. So prisons should be fearful places in the sense that you always felt you were being watched.
Bentham was an equal opportunity surveillant. He wanted to, I think a lot about courts. He wrote a ton about what judges were supposed to do. And what he said was, when presiding at trial, a judge is on trial. People behave better when they're watched. So it wasn't only people in detention that Bentham wanted watched. He wanted government,
everybody,
judges. It's equal up. That's one piece. And so it wasn't privatizing. It was publicity is a word that Bentham invented. And Bentham was also deeply interested in trying to curb arbitrary power. He invented the word codification. So Bentham's out there in innovative, sometimes very dark ways.
Yeah, he's such an important, just as an aside, it's one of the most astonishing things that no one's written a proper biography of Bentham. It's astonishing, given the numbers of biographies written, that a man of such importance, such centrality to the law and politics and utilitarianism has never received a proper biography. I'm just suggesting maybe, Judith, that could be your next project, but go on.
UCL has the Bentham Project. There are more than 100,000 pages between the British Library and UCL of Bentham original writing. They've digitalized most of it. So one daunting task for anybody who wants to be the biographer is to take on what you'd need to read and know in order to think about this stunning, complicated, dark and bright person who was egalitarian.
Appropriate kind of punishment and pain. So
let me circle back to an important part of the Enlightenment story. Some of these people are looking past as retributivists. You did something wrong, I want to punish you. Some of them, and Bentham is more a rational actor model, pain and pleasure, and he wants to have you have incentives to behave. And he's looking forward along with Beccaria. The invention in the second half of the 20th century from prisoners and people who've been in detention is that my present matters as well. And while you can punish me for deterrence, incapacitation, retribution, reformation, pick your categories and explanations, and purposefulness, what you can't do is try to just treat me as a non-human, because I'm a person who has equal status. And this book is trying to help people see that up until basically World War II, civil rights movement here, de Tocqueville to dozens of reformers, the invention of a profession called correction, people caring about being effective, people caring about humanity, people caring about well-being, lots of care, amazing amount of reasoning about how to punish, but not a complete commitment, until we get back to London in a minute, to the idea that people who are incarcerated are prisoners, are people with rights who have status and shouldn't be ruined or harmed while they're in detention in ways that disable them. And then I just need to add, so World War I's and II are really important in the history of punishment, but not as much on the screen as I hope they will now be. After World War I, a group of women who were reformers in...
Yeah, and just to be clear, your book is divided into three, from the 1800s to World War II, then from 65 through to 70, and then from the 70s today. Let me ask you one other question before we get into the details of the book, Judith.
Sure.
It's a broad question, a non-legal question. Often, and you know this better than I do, many histories, particularly in a Foucaultian tradition, and also a leftist tradition, treat the development of criminal justice and in the West and democracy, and we'll come to democracy in a minute because your subtitle of your book is How Prison Became a Problem for Democracy. They treat the democracy project, the liberal democracy project, as if there's an element of cruelty to it. In your narrative in Impermissible Punishments, is the theory of justice and of punishment, is it by definition cruel?
No. I'm going to say something important that Jeremy Bentham said. Some people begrudge giving prisoners anything, and some people bemoan the need to be human. Humanity requires taking care of them. You don't have to be cruel to say that you did something that you shouldn't have done, and that you need some constraint on your liberty or ordinary life because you've done that. That doesn't require for a nanosecond having somebody in a room that's 5 by 7 that they can't leave for 30 years, nor waterboarding, nor treadwills, which England had, nor whipping, pick your category, food deprivation. The key is that you can express distress, horror, upsetness, and anger without diminishing and aggressing against the person who has done wrong. And one of the important elements that lessons of horrific treatment of all kinds of people horrific treatment ended up giving us lessons that horrific treatment is horrible, no matter what you've done. And there are countries in the world, coming back to your sad comments that have more truth than I would wish about the United States, there are countries in the world that are struggling with the challenge of punishing people who've done really bad things without diminishing their personhood in a way that is aggressive.
Judith, you've described the American punishment system as being inherited from Europe, from the Anglo-French tradition. You've mentioned de Tocqueville and Bentham, of course. But the American Republic had one thing that France, England, most of Europe didn't have, which of course was racialized slavery. How does that fit into your narrative of the first part of the history of American punishment and how prison became a problem for democracy?
So if we go, whether it's Italy, France, England, and other influences, all of those countries had hierarchies and colonialism and various ways of race, religion, ethnic control. In a 1780s atlas trying to sell the glories of Amsterdam with 100 folios, 20% of them show houses of detention, orphans, old people, men's house of corrections, women's house of corrections, on and on. So the idea of control of something seen as deviant or other is not alone. And of course, slavery existed in many parts of the world. U.S. has a horrible pact with slavery at its founding that is still part of 21st century struggles. So race is really important in the story. And race is a driver of forms of disability. And it is the understanding starting in the 1950s of the similarity between practices in prison and practices on plantations and practices in concentration camps that moves the world internationally to recognize the right that people of all kinds have to be understood as equal in terms of rights at some level that limits the harm that can be the harm that the country or entity can do to them. So if I just back up for a minute to the great feminists in the 1920s in England, who were the first of their kind to say, prisoners after World War I, prisoners have rights, whether you're political, whoever you are, suffragette, whatever you are, you should be understood as a rights bearer, and prison can be torture. By then, there's something called the International Penal Penitentiary Commission. Europe and the United States, some South and Central America, some colonies around the world are part of an official government-appointed every 5-year Congress is what should prison look like? What should the rules be? And these astute women politicians convinced the League of Nations, which is born in 1920, to get interested in the problems of prison as a transnational problem, as a problem that isn't just domestic and national. And they push for a Bill of Rights for prisoners, and the project gets taken over, and in 1934, promulgated for the first time in the world, is something called the Standard Minimum Rules for the Treatment of Prisoners from a humanitarian, quote unquote, social point of view. And the word rights isn't there, and the word torture isn't there, and the right dignity isn't there. It is good to have clean air and more food and good things, but it also licenses whipping, corporal punishment, dark rooms, i.e. dungeons, food deprivation, sometimes saying if a doctor will permit it, if a medical officer will permit it. And one bright light, a trigger that anybody should think of, should operate on, should function under. If any punishment comes with a question, be sure a doctor says it's okay, good enough reason not to do it. Here we are in 1934. Hitler has taken.
Let me just ask one other question.
Sure.
You've obviously researched this with a great deal of care. You suggest that the idea of human rights for prisoners was developed after the First World War by suffragettes. What did or didn't, let me just finish the question. What did or didn't traditional 19th century liberals, John Stuart Mill comes to mind, and particularly in his book on liberty, what did he, and of course his whole career, all his thinking was a reaction to his godfather, Jeremy Bentham. What did 19th century liberalism think about prisons and punishment and the idea of prisoners having human rights? Did they just ignore it?
So it wasn't, just to back up, in addition to the suffragettes and the feminists in England, there are a bunch of people who are in detention who say we have rights, and nobody was listening to them. So I just want to be clear that the first page in the book is Winston Talley, a prisoner in Arkansas in 1965, who writes a petition to the court to say, stop the whip, because people who were in detention understood themselves as people before the world recognized it. And it was only after concentration camps and the civil human rights movement of the second half of the 20th century that that point struck enough chords that it became, at a formal level, we haven't talked about on the ground yet, at a formal level, an idea of a commitment. And now we'll get back to all those 1900s, really amazing thinkers. The idea, prisoners were seen as civilly dead, civil death on both civil European systems and common law English American systems. No property, no contract, no liberty was extinguished by your conviction, no rights bearing. And it's the invention during the 20th century that sticks as the world gets hopefully shocked forever by the horrors of humanity's inhumanity to others, civilization's destruction of others, that the idea gets rooted in an idea of legal jurisprudential personhood. That, and just for a moment, realize precisely because you're talking about the liberality of the many people in the 1900s and 1800s, is how innovative political theorists these prisoners are, to say that, yes, you can punish me, but not like that, because I retain liberty. So just as the famous Italian Beccaria and Bentham and others are famous philosophers of punishment, so too are these prisoners, who have a different theory of punishment than had been there before. And their theory is they continue to have rights, and there are certain forms of punishment that are off the charts because their present matters, whatever your purposefulness. And credit goes to those 1900s people to say, you got to have purposes, but the range of purposes has to shift once we understand these people's humanity.
But also, coming back to this idea, given that there were those, I guess, liberals or people perhaps on the left who thought prison could reform, and there were great reformist movements, I know, in the United Kingdom and in the United States, wasn't the idea of rights a kind of, or giving prisoner rights, a kind of utility? Because if you gave them rights, they could reform themselves. It was more than just a human right. There was a utility involved too.
I wish, yeah, of course it would be useful to understand people's agency and equality. I have scoured, however extensive my effort to try to capture 300 years is, I can tell you I've read hundreds more of these pages, and all of the 55 rules in 1934 did not use the language of rights. In 1955, the United Nations first standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners says rights and dignity. Bing, there it is. After the Universal UN is founded in 1946, in 1948 is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then prisoners are understood as part of all humanity, as rights bearers parts. And that's a really, there's a reason I don't like to use the word reentry in contemporary words, because prisoners are always here. The question is, what's their status? And to take seriously the desire to confine, punish, or do something to represent the wrongness of conduct that has occurred. It's a problem to figure out once you really take seriously the project of rightsdom, how to behave. You've pointed out, of course, it would have been useful, and it is useful, and indeed, riding on your coattails, it's super useful to realize that people need to be understood as agents of change. And yes, you can find in some of these writings, if we get into the weeds, a debate about whether, how harsh should you be? How much should you whip them? Because don't you want moral reflection? But reformation and moral reflection and even change and the like is not the same as you and I are on the same plane in terms of rights. You've done something wrong. I can limit them in some ways, but I can never act like you cannot stand to challenge and shackle in some way the power of the state to my rights.
So we have this, you presented this as a universal phenomenon. Is there any difference between the US and Europe, given that punishment and prisons in the US, I think, were always larger, perhaps more dramatic and more controversial in their own way than in Europe, or is that oversimplified?
Yeah, sorry, it is oversimplified. There's this huge, the biggest building in 1780s in Amsterdam is that men's house of detention. And it's the largest of that decade. So large-scale detention is not unique to the United States. The United States has larger scale detention now and very large buildings. Absolutely. But so do some other places. The divergence.
Well, the other place that comes to mind is China. What other places are you thinking?
Well, let me also be clear. I am trying to capture ambitiously the transatlantic, and this isn't a global history. There's a very interesting book called The Global Convict. There are other books, but limiting my scope to some extent. The second is that the divergence after World War II is many countries in Europe understand that the welfare of people inside and outside prisons or detention or homelessness or wherever you are, statelessness, are the welfare, everyone's welfare is linked. And that understanding generated a set of social basic benefits, housing, education, healthcare, and the like for everyone. So when people are in detention in the United States, they are actually housed and have some rights to minimally adequate, we hope, healthcare that people who are on the streets do not have because the United States doesn't share that commitment. So one radical divergence between the two systems that is a 20th century divergence comes after World War II, with the US not having the kind of social welfare scaffolding that the European countries have. Step two, in the 1960s and 70s, US prisoners are in court before they're in court in the European Courts of Human Rights at that time. They get there in the 80s and 90s as enforcing the European rules on prison and the like. And as prisoners come to court, there is an opening for the potential for a serious encounter between rights and punishment that will mitigate some of the harms. As I recount in the book, which also has the history of the only whipping trial in the United States, a transcript of justifications for whipping in the 1960s, and then a discussion of Arkansas's terrible prison system, that a judge says it's a dark and evil world and the entire system is cruel and unusual in 1970 and needs to be reformed. And that's repeated whether you're in California or Ohio. It's not a Southern story. It's a story across the United States. There's a period of time when it looks like 60s, 70s, both the United States and Europe are struggling with this problem in comparable ways. And then what happens in the United States is the retrenchment on rights in and outside of prison in terms of civil egalitarian commitments pulls the United States back. It retreats.
Well, when you say, what years are you talking about this retrenchment? You talk about
starting in the 1980s, for example, 1981.
Right. So we're talking. So the part. Before we get to part three, let's get to part two. So part two is the sunniest period. Is it in your narrative?
Well, I think sunny.
I mean, the sun comes out a little bit. Maybe it's not.
Yes. No. I think it's important to appreciate. One of my colleagues calls this memory work, Reva Siegel. It's important to appreciate that there are eras when there are shared commitments, legislative models, statutes for prisoners' rights, not just courts at all, executive authority and courts and popular interest in making change to lessen the harm. And the harm of detention, you've pointed out, racialized deeply, destructive of communities and health and families. So that harm is vivid along with other racialized harms in the United States in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, grows transatlantic with energy and economic, a sense of economic well-being for at least some sectors that pushes for change with struggles and disagreements and variation. And then what happens? So if we want to sit more with that period, let's not be clear about it. It comes from the radical darkness of World War II, when the fascist regimes use food deprivation, whips, chains, on and on, things I don't even like to think about, prisons had too much in common with that. And so the revolution post World War II is to say, we, in a huge meaning of we, don't want anybody treated like that.
Are you saying, though, that the prisons in the United States or the United Kingdom in the 1930s were similar to the prisons in fascist Italy or Germany?
In ways that are very disquieting to think about. They weren't trying to end by murdering people. Indeed, they were feeding and keeping them. And some of the people who ran prisons were trying their damnedest, even during World War II, to keep people alive and safe. But shaved heads, treadwheels, whips, forced labor, those are all practices that we have very sadly in common. And indeed, it is the English who, in those standard minimum rules in 1934, are the fierce defenders of using strapping, birching, flogging. There are a lot of different words, but that form of corporal punishment was seen as appropriate behavior to keep something called discipline. Now we'll be back at Foucault. Keep discipline in terms of order. And by insisting on order and forced work, licensing discipline in terms of more radical punishment for people who aren't subservient and under control. And if you just realize that corrections is sadly aptly named in the sense that it is aiming, that's a US word, they don't use the word necessarily in non-English speaking, but the idea of trying to correct and control is so dysfunctional. Dysfunctional for the people, dysfunctional for the social order, dysfunctional for the staff who's trying to do it. If I flash forward for a moment, there's a great deal of literature about how bad it is for people who work in bad detention facilities. They have higher blood pressure, more mental health issues, physical issues. So the idea that this is a harmful activity, it's bad for everybody. And there's a man, let me get to the cheerful period. In 1950, in the last international congress of this organization that ends, called the International Penal Penitentiary Commission, a man named Paul Creny, who had been the head of the Belgian prison system and briefly interned by the Nazis, speaks at this. He's a very important person in this organization, and he says, someday we'll look at incarceration as primitive as corporal punishment because it so strips people of their autonomy. And it is that insight that you shouldn't have systems that aim to take away autonomy. And now giving credit to the Transatlantic Project, when I've walked into detention facilities in Italy or France, you see people wearing their own clothes, prisoners. Staff may wear denim to distinguish them or not, or some outfit. The idea of trying to enable people to be people, whatever your constraints, is got to be part of the points of punishment.
So we have this chink of light in your part two in the 60s, particularly in the United States when it comes to civil rights. And then the darkness seems to encompass this again, part three, where you talk from the 70s to today. What happened from the 70s onwards in terms of the history of punishment and correction in the United States, to use a word?
Well, let's go to the light and the dark. So there are moments in the 70s and 80s where where legislatures and courts and governors and presidents try to lessen the harms of detention. And there's big efforts at parole, probation, alternatives, community-based corrections. A whole host of activities are underway in some of that era, and it's also, as I said before, varied by some states. Then the drumbeat of a war on crime, a war on drugs, these war metaphors, which we are living sadly with at the moment in the United States, should be not used because they license undue aggression without sufficient reflection. So and the retreat from commitments to commitments to figuring out more to get more racial equality and economic class equality moves the United States political realm to elect leaders who say nothing works, harsh on crime, this is useless, and build an enterprise that crosses party aisles that supports the building of secure, maximum security facilities. And with the rise in prosecution, if we do the history, as is of interest to both of us and hopefully other people, crime and prosecution rates were relatively flat, and incarceration rates. And in the 80s, it takes off. If we just take step by step, you put a bunch of people in a facility that is concrete, metal, noisy, dense, you increase the crowding, you have to pay for staffing, you underpay the staff and undertrain the staff. You're desperately struggling for control. And some of those people are mentally ill, and some of those people have done violent things, and everybody's out of their depth. And what they're trying to do is keep control. So you watch in the United States the growth of the expansion of the use of something called solitary confinement, 24/7 in a cell or 22 hours in a cell, small, minimal opportunity for any physical or social interaction. You're watching the growth in a variety of ways of more punishment, with, sadly, as you were describing the United States at the very beginning of this, no social utility for building a country where people are.
So do we have in this period a divergence, and does the privatization of the prison system in the United States, to some extent, does that play a role in this?
Privatization is something that we need to talk about. Somewhere between 8 and 12% of people who are incarcerated in the United States after conviction are in private prisons, run by private companies. That's different from, do you outsource food, healthcare, a whole bunch of things, or private pieces? And by the way, England is big into the private sector of prison provision too, as are places around the world. And global corporate private prison providers are an important part of the story, with a segment of the market here. The important part is, in coming back to the European commitment, in 2006, there are European prison rules that talk about normalization and regularization. Get prisons as close to regular world as you can, because everybody's going to get out, or almost everybody's going to get out, and it's not very helpful to anybody to disable them. Then you have this transnational corporate power. Some of those corporations sell that they're providing care, and they're complying with rights regimes. So there is a potential to use the private sector for good as well as not so good. And there is a debate about whether private can do better or not. There are some systems that say you're not supposed to use private prisons at all, but you got to define it. So the issue of one is who does it, but whether you're public or private, you should be governed by public rules. Right now, we've got ICE detention and immigration in the United States that is a lot by private companies. But of course, the point should be whoever's doing it, you have to comply with rules about how you treat the people who are inside. So the dark, if you want to go dark period, you could talk 1970s to now, a basic commitment to prisoners as rights bearing, with the view that we're disagreeing about what it means. Europe says as much as you can, take away as little as possible. The US says everything's taken away. What do we have to give back? If you do it in a very crude
So very, very simply, Judith, is there a fundamental cleavage then between the US and Western Europe after the 70s or no?
The answer after the 80s is there is a cleavage that has deepened because Europe continues to have a stronger commitment to a human civil rights model, and the United States writ large, not all states, have retreated from that form of commitment that is licensing behavior in the United States prison system that wouldn't be formally licensed in Europe. But let me just underscore, I keep saying the word formal. Having rights on paper, I'm all in, but having rights on the ground is all the more important. And so France, where I was last year, speaking about this, the front page headlines are incredibly crowded prisons, unsafe prisons. Having the rules on paper requires translation in practice, which requires political will, which gets me back to good old Jeremy Bentham and how annoying it is to have to provide resources for people who've done ill. And one has to realize you're providing resources for yourself as well, because we're all in this together.
So finally, the subtitle of your new book, Impermissible Punishments, is How Prison Became a Problem for Democracy. Why, in your view, has prison become a problem for democracy? And of course, also, how do we try to address this problem? How do we fix it?
It's a problem. Let's explain democracy here. Democracy for me is more than popular will picking whatever it wants. The democratic value of each person as a rights-bearing participant in a democratic order is part of democracy. And once you are all rights-bearing, then how we punish you isn't the problem that de Tocqueville wrote about, because he said it's okay to be despotic. And if you're in a democratic order, totalitarianism is supposed to be out. And indeed, there are opinions in the 1970s and 80s where judges say, well, there's no iron curtain between the Constitution and the prison, because of this idea that the Constitution is alive and rights are alive in every space in the United States. That's important. And so then the problem is, how do we punish? And here I just want to underscore, there's a reason the book starts with a handwritten petition from a prisoner. It's because it's prisoners who had the imagination and understanding of themselves as rights bearers. You know, the UN's 2015 standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners are called the Nelson Mandela rules. Think about Nelson Mandela's imagination of himself in apartheid South Africa as a human being with rights. Those UN 2015 rules are aptly named because it's prisoners who understood themselves as people and convinced other people, including lawmakers, that they were. That is the important success of the post-World War II era. And the risk right now, acute in the United States, but not in other countries. Be clear. When we talk divergence and convergence, as we watch political will expressed in similar ways in various parts of the world, the challenge is to hold on to that point that we're all in this together, and how you treat a person with or without citizenship status, a person who's been convicted, how you treat a person of different colored skins, race, ethnicity, religion. All of these are at risk if you say, I can draw lines and treat some of you differently than others of you, because you don't have rights as a shorthand for equal status. You know, Hannah Arendt famously said the right to have rights coming out of a world of statelessness. If we see prisoners as previously stateless and now understand their own rights, they're telling a story that's all of our stories, because we are affected together in a social order that is deeply at risk.
And Arendt, of course, I think she said that in We Refugees, her essay, and when she came to the United States. But what about, finally, Judith, this is such a long and interesting subject that we can't do, excuse the word, justice to all of it. But what about coming to the America of the 2025? What about the rights of quote unquote aliens, of people who came to this country and didn't fill out the right forms? Should they have rights?
Absolutely. Not a hard question. The question of whether they get to stay is a different question from whether or not, while they're here, you have to take care. And first of all, we know from a variety of documents that some of the people who are described as alien are US citizens, et cetera, et cetera. Hold that aside. If you're here you're here, we have to be sure that we take you as a person with dignity and rights. Go back to 1948. It's called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights on purpose. And it doesn't mean everybody gets the same. It doesn't mean everybody gets to stay, but it does mean no shaved heads, no deportation, no lack of inquiry, no deportation without inquiry and serious understanding, no family separation. These are techniques of totalitarian regimes. And we have to, that gets me back to detention. You have to be careful because it leaks. If I can grab people off the streets of Los Angeles or Chicago or in Ohio, if I can grab people inside a detention facility, the lines have to stay strong, that government agents cannot use excessive force to grab people, because we're a law-based social order that constrains the power of everyone for everyone.
Yeah, maybe the word that we haven't used is a relevant one: dignity, human dignity. It's one that we'll take up later this season. We have a conversation with the LSE political philosopher Leah Upi, who has a new book out on dignity. So I think Judith Resnik's introduction to the idea, I guess, of human rights or dignity for prisoners, impermissible punishment, is not only an introduction, but obviously important in its own right. Wonderful conversation, Judith. I apologize. I'm sure I will get criticized for interrupting you incessantly. It's the only time I'll have the opportunity to interrupt famous Yale law professors, but real honor to talk to you. Congratulations on the book, and I'd love to get you back on the show. Maybe we can get you on with Leah to talk about human dignity. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'd be delighted to continue the conversation, and it's a pleasure for me. The book is just out, to talk about it with you.